Yeah, good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm an economist myself by training, and throughout most of my professional life, what I have done is to look at policy issues and advise and criticize policymakers. But I always welcome the opportunity to talk to the people who actually make the economy work, which is you, this audience here. And my purpose is perhaps to give you somewhat different in a sense that I can give you perhaps some of the longer term, medium term trends which are shaping events. That's why my presentation will also be very short of pictures and more some general trends. I'm also cognizant of the fact that I'm standing between you and lunch. I think the scheduled lunchtime was around 15 minutes from now, but I was assured by the organizer that I can take perhaps a little bit more time. So with this caveat, let me perhaps start. And what I wanted to do is to take first perhaps a look at what are the factors driving not the outcome, the evolution of this war, which has so much changed everything in Europe, but including also the global economic outlook. I have some caveat to saying maybe the war is not responsible for everything. And then I wanted to delve a bit more into the European situation, which is in a sense particular because of the gas story, which is very much considered a European story, but I will try to argue that it's not only a European story. And then perhaps a big outlook for the major economic areas, not for the next quarter, but more again to emphasize some longer term trends. I think you have seen very good presentations here of what the forecasts are of the major international institutions and so on. I don't want to go into this number game. So on the war, here I must say I'm a bit concerned. I'm a bit concerned because it is difficult to conceive any potential compromise after the annexation of these 4 provinces by Russia, because Ukraine cannot accept that, and it might be difficult for anybody in Russia, whether it's Putin or his successor, to accept that this annexation was a sham. So it's very, very difficult. For the time being, I'm not a military expert, but for the time being, I cannot see that any side has an overwhelming advantage. That means it's a war of attrition, but a war of attrition in which one side, which is smaller actually from the outset, Ukraine, has a very large reservoir of help and support it can expect from abroad. So this war will become a war of wills. That's what Clausewitz already taught over 150 years ago, but also a question of the means to pursue it. And here, my estimation is that in terms of the pure economics or the means to pursue a war, the so-called the Western camp has its advantage. Here I have given you some power indicators for 4 different power indicators for Russia, the US, the EU, and China. My estimation is that China is professing a great friendship with Russia, but it's really keeping out. There has been no material support from China to Russia. And therefore, let's look a little bit at some of these power indicators. The blue one is nuclear missiles or nuclear warheads, actually. And there you can see, actually, Russia is the biggest. Whereas the EU, which is mainly France, and China are actually very, very small, right? That is not a very important part of their power base. Then you have the population, where Russia is again the smallest. And then perhaps the most important one is the GDP, the size of the economy. And here you can see that Russia is really minuscule compared to either Europe or the United States. The Russian GDP is approximately 1/20th of that of the United States. So in terms of pursuing a war of attrition over a long period, Russia is, I think, not in a very good position, provided, of course, the West keeps the will to support Ukraine. And then in terms of military expenditure, you see a similar picture. There we all know the United States is basically the only game in town. But even Europe together, in terms of military expenditure, dwarfs Russia. So on the conventional indicators, or the indicators for a conventional war of attrition, Russia is weak. The only indicator, the only strong point they have is basically the nuclear weapons and the hope that somehow via higher gas prices, that this will undermine European cohesiveness and solidarity. But to be honest, European solidarity is important for Europe itself. But the main backer financially and also militarily, of course, of Ukraine is the US, the UK, and then Europe is a distant third. And that unfortunately brings me to the conclusion that for Russia, the nuclear option remains an option. A low probability, but of course a very high impact event. And I'm afraid that the worse Russia does, the better Europe does over this winter, the less unlikely it will become. And of course, all economic forecasts are always under the condition that this doesn't happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm just saying if I look at the way this war evolves, and here I'm taking a very cold view, I'm not looking at the human suffering which we have going on every day, and the latest news of missiles on Ukrainian cities. But the basic forces, underlying forces for a conventional war of attrition look pretty bad for Russia. And the question then whether they will fall back on their only strong point. Who knows? But I just wanted you to be aware of this. Okay, let's come back now to the more economic part and look at Europe's energy conundrum. Let me make one parenthesis at the very beginning. We'll talk a lot about gas, but even for oil, Europe has a problem because the oil in euros is at a record level. Everybody looks at the Brent price in dollars, but the Brent price in dollars, even at 98 with the euro at parity, is very expensive. And now let me come more specifically to the gas, where I think one has to look at details. And I suspect some of you in this audience actually know some of that stuff. Because at the political level, everybody looks at the spot prices, the famous spot prices, the TTF. And they have exploded to 300 over the summer and then have gone down at levels which are, let's say, even now today, 10 times of 2 years ago. But, and that I will show you later, actually, the actual prices paid are not as high. And I suspect many of the producers in this room who use gas will not pay the TTF price, at least for most of the quantities, but the much lower price, which I will show. And then I would like to argue that we should not forget that Europe and Asia are linked via LNG in terms of prices. The link is not perfect, but it's important in the long to medium run, in the medium to long run, because it means that one important competitor of European industry, which is Asian industry, pays the same price, including China. And then perhaps I will say something about the reason for high energy prices. So if you bear with me, let's walk you through some of the data to illustrate some of these issues. Now, let me come to the first one. why do we have high energy prices? And now I'm saying gas and petrol and oil, and to some extent coal together. Now, the first thing you see here is that the global investment in upstream oil and gas has actually fallen strongly over the last years. Right? It's almost halved between 2015 and now. Moreover, the part of that expenditure dedicated to conventional discoveries has also gone down. So you have a double whammy, right? The overall expenditure goes down, and the part which is spent on conventional exploration has also fallen. So it's no surprise then that the supply of oil and gas is stagnating. Used to increase regularly every year, but over the last year, the increase has come down and down. And that's why we find us now, after a few years of too little investment, in a situation whereby there's just no spare capacity, zero in gas and very little in oil. So that's important to keep in mind. It's not just the war, but it's also this underlying force which has been effective for quite some time. Now, if we talk about gas now specifically, the first question is, how do we actually measure the price of gas? Because you have one price for households, one price for industrial consumers, you have one price for big importers. If you look at it carefully, you see that the attention on the TTF price, which has moved a lot of, or which has influenced a lot of the policymakers in Brussels, is misguided. So here's what everybody knows. It's the TTF price. It was already high before the war started. Then over the summer, it went up to a peak. And then right when Putin announced de facto put the embargo on Western Europe, the price has come down. North Stream pipeline bombed, a little bit up and then down again. Right? But that's typical of financial markets. They anticipate, and then when the news materializes, it's no longer news, it's priced in. Right? So I'm not surprised. I would not expect the TTF price to react to things which were known already yesterday. Right? So, but it's still very high, and of course, much, much higher than before. But consider this slide, perhaps, which is a bit complicated. Here you have this mauve line on the top, which is the TTF price, monthly averages. Right? You don't see all the ups and downs, which I showed earlier. And then below, you have the average import price paid by different countries. And there I just take the value of imports, the dollars paid, and divide them by the quantity. And you see that the actual prices have increased as well, but remain much, much lower than the TTF. So the actual cost of natural gas for Europe has increased, yes, but not to the extent. You see this little blue line jumping up. And now, why do we have these much lower prices? Because most gas is delivered, and I presume the steel producers know that, under long-term contracts, which have usually some indexation, very often on oil, or very often in the past on oil, but sometimes also on the TTF and others. But these prices increase slowly. And there's only one, or say, supplier who doesn't deliver on its long-term contracts, and that's Russia. All the other suppliers are still delivering and therefore keeping the actual price much below the TTF. You go to the TTF only if you have some small additional thing, quantity which you need. And then, but Germany was depending a lot on Russian suppliers, on Gazprom, and they're not delivering. So that's why the average price for Germany goes up by more than that of its other competitors. But I suspect that it will be a short term. So therefore, I would say the TTF price is important for small additional quantities. The actual cost for gas in Europe has increased. It's very high, but it is not at the height which one would think it has when one looks at the TTF. It's still less than 100 euros per megawatt hour, right? Of course, and this is important also for the political discussion, in Europe, the high price of gas has spilled over into the high price of electricity. Because electricity is priced off the most expensive marginal source, which is gas turbines, basically. But here you see also that there are very big differences across member states. Because in France and Germany, for example, the so-called merit order works. If you need gas for the last megawatt hour, then the price is very high. In Poland, they use coal, whose price has increased, but not as much. And in Spain, they have actually subsidized the use of gas. So you see that that's already first indication that the famous internal market in the EU doesn't work very well. We now have very highly different prices for electricity. My suspicion is this will not last forever. Whenever you look at, I think if we meet next year again, I think when we look back at this year, we will see crazy movements in the charts, but then slowly we will see a convergence again. And the same applies also, I think, to the price difference between Europe and Asia. Here you see three lines. The gray line is that of the happy Americans, the Henry Hub, right? Which chucks down there, and the Americans are protesting because it increases by 50–60%, right? And you see in the past it was very close to to European and Asian prices, right? JKM is a Japan-Korea marker, right? So most of the time they all chuck along at the bottom, and then comes first 2021, and you see both Asia and Europe go up, with the TTF being more nervous, so to speak. And then you see over the summer, you see now a discount emerging of Asia over Europe, which is not surprising because you have all these LNG ships which have to make Dimi 2 and come to Europe. Right now, you see a hefty discount. I think this will not last very long. I think we will go back in a year or two where prices in Asia and Europe are very similar in terms of natural gas. Not similar to the United States. It will take a long time because the United States has very limited export capacities. But I think that's very important for European industry. Because every single country looks at, my industry has a competitive disadvantage because the gas price has increased. But since the gas price increases for everybody in Europe, and also for the Asians, I think it is not really a competitive disadvantage for Europe compared to Asia. Of course, compared to the US, that's true. That's why the US is now exporting lots of fertilizers to Europe, and the fertilizer is basically a form of natural gas, right? But it's just not enough. There's still an oversupply of natural gas in the United States relative to Europe and Asia. But therefore, I would really say in Europe, we shouldn't be too afraid of high gas prices. We share the pain with our biggest competitors in industrial goods, which after all is Asia. I don't know whether this also applies to Turkey, but that is something the audience will know better. And then for Europe, we have to take into account that when the energy price increases for all companies then also can increase their prices. I don't know whether it applies to steel as well, because everybody faces the same cost pressure. And here I give you the example for Germany, where you can see that, yes, import prices have increased after long years, right? Totally stable. Import prices suddenly go up to 140, 150. But export prices also increase. So German companies have actually making good profits, and companies throughout Europe, because wage costs have not increased a lot, and the higher energy prices, they can translate into higher export prices. And therefore, again, this is for me a symptom that for Europe, it's a hard hit, the energy prices, but it is offset to some extent. The biggest problem for Europe, I think, is a political one. Namely that in every country, consumers say, oh, we having these high prices, we cannot pay for them. You must save our industry. And in Germany, just today, the German Export Commission presented their plan, how to save German industry. Which, as I said earlier, this I find is the wrong approach because all industry in Europe faces the same price. It doesn't make sense for Germany to say we have to save our industry. And then, of course, consumers, who are voters, they say, we cannot pay these high prices. Government, you have to help us. To which the government should respond, we in Europe have to pay these high prices to our suppliers. Very little we can get around. If we, government, support you, consumer, then we have to tax you, consumer, to get the money, right? Just left pocket, right pocket in the aggregate. But governments, of course, have to pretend that they will save everybody. And the problem for Europe is if there's an uncoordinated race, everybody subsidizes his or her industry. And then the other countries say, you look, the neighbors are doing that, we need to do something similar. So that's the danger of a state aid to the top. I give the example of Spain. Now, politically, Germany has embarked on a similar path, although actually the German measures are very different from the Spanish one. We can discuss that later. In Brussels, what is most likely now to come through is a sort of dynamic price cap, whereas Brussels will somehow say you cannot pay more in Europe at the wholesale level for gas than a certain international benchmark. One benchmark could be the same price as in Japan plus €1, right? Others propose how we make the average between Japan and the United States, so much lower. But that's not, nobody knows how they would actually do that. They're going slow. They just want to give a political system. We care for you, voters, and we will somehow reduce the price of gas. Although everybody knows that for Europe, the key issue is how actually to have prices which incentivize people, including industry, to save on gas. So my view is that the energy price shock for Europe is important. It's differentiated across countries depending on their energy mix. I would say it is manageable in the end. Of course, under the proviso which I give there of a normal winter and international prices do not spike again. So basically, if Asia doesn't consume too much, then we have more left for Europe. Right? The ideal would be if the Chinese use even more coal and less gas, that liberates gas for us, and if we pay enough, we'll get it. In the medium term, I think there will be an offset through higher export prices, of which we already see the beginning, and then the fact that we are suffering along with Asia. So I wouldn't write off Europe totally. That would be my concern. And therefore, my answer to the question, recession, is always, we already have an industrial recession in the sense that industrial production is going down. And I think somebody, the previous speaker, mentioned what the definition of a recession is. I'm not so sure that the wider economy will go down. And as we already seen, the spot price have gone down, the nervousness goes down. I think maybe it won't look that bad. And also, which I haven't put on the slide, but of course, the incentive to invest in energy savings and in green, right, is now exploding. And therefore, not immediately, not over a few weeks or months, but over time, that part of investment will go up. For the others, I agree also, there was a previous speaker who talked about the housing sector in China. Basically, China is slowing down under a trend. It's not just that they discovered this year that maybe they have constructed enough houses for every Chinese, but this comes over time, right? And then also it was already mentioned that the US has less of a problem with high energy prices because they are a small net energy producer. But I wouldn't forget I shouldn't forget, or we shouldn't forget, that the United States has a fiscal hangover. They had extraordinarily fiscal support last year. Give you the numbers there. This is 15% of GDP almost, which is reduced to 5. So still a lot, but from 15 to 5, that means a lot less. And that's, I think, the reason why we will have some cooling down of the American economy. Whether it's next quarter or the one, I don't know, but that is what I see. So where did I have these? Let me just check. No, where? Let me just come back here to the growth outlook here. And here I've given you the IMF groups, which is the blue line in the middle is the world. The greenish line top is the emerging markets. And then you have basically the advanced countries on the bottom. And the key takeaway is not so much that they go up and down, and what are the last, but that the three are converging, right? So the emerging markets used to have really a big growth premium, right, over developed economies. And that has been going down over time, and the emerging markets have not been immune to the two shocks which we have had, COVID, and now whatever, energy, right? So this is, for me, the main takeaway. And if you look at the three biggest economies in the world, you see something similar. You see the US and the euro area chugging along at the bottom, with the yellow line usually a little bit above the blue line. So that is the US, which grows 0.5 percentage more than the EU, than the euro area on average, right? But you see, this shock has been very similar, and now the predictions are that they will be almost identical. And then, as I said earlier, the Chinese are coming down from very, very high levels to, let's say, still high levels by our standards, but very lower. But this is a trend decline, right? It's not last this year. As I said, basically what you see there, what economists call the decreasing returns from scale to investment. If you have built every subway you need, every house you need, then after a while, okay, now what do I do? Right? And that's their problem. They have talked for 10 years now of stimulating domestic consumption. There's no magic button the government in Beijing can push to have more domestic consumption because people earn very little and spend little. Then if you put them at home and close them in at home, they can spend even less. So that's the trend. Let me just say one thing about surprise inflation. Inflation, and already I've given away. My point is about surprise inflation. I realize if you come from Turkey, inflation is very bad. You come from perhaps Egypt also. But if you are in good old Europe, where prices were almost flat for years and years, where governments have then accumulated all their debt in terms of very tiny interest rates, then when suddenly the price level increases, the government can say, now the real value of our debt has gone down, right? That's what surprise inflation does. Now, you would say, okay, from now on onwards, inflation is no longer a surprise, right? We know, we don't know exactly, but we no longer expect 1.5 in inflation, right? So interest rates have incorporated to some extent. And that I wanted to show you that still, even going forward, after the real value of debt has been devalued, the financing conditions of governments are very good, especially compared to the financial crisis period. So here I show you something which is called the snowball effect, which is if you look at the government burden of paying, serving its debt, we have the interest rate, but on the other hand, if nominal GDP increases, your income increases as a government, because your taxes are usually a fixed percentage of GDP. So if you see the zero line, if the interest rate is lower than the growth rate of GDP, you can sit there as a government, do nothing, and over time, things will get better. If it is above the line, if the interest rate's more, then you really have to work out, you have to swim against the stream because the interest rate is higher than the growth rate, right? And here you see for Italy, for example, for Italy, it has been above the line, that's the yellow, the orange line, has been above with peaks of 5%. So interest rates 5% higher than normal GDP. That's a very heavy burden on financing. And then if you go to 21, 22, 23, now suddenly you see negative values for Italy and Spain. So right now they can just sit there pretty and pay very little on their old obligations outstanding, and nominal GDP increases, their tax revenue increase. So in principle, they have an advantage. And that's why I think that at present, we're not talking about a second financial crisis. Certainly not a second euro crisis, because this crisis is different. In the euro crisis 2008, when you had that peak there, you had less growth and higher costs because risk premia went up. And now you have somewhat higher interest rates, but nominal GDP growth has gone up so much that it overwhelms that. And if you look at the cost, let's say for let's say banks or corporations which borrow from the banks. Here, let's say I have again nominal GDP growth, but for the entire euro area. That is the rate at which, on average for industry, you can expect your revenues to increase, on average, right? I don't know whether steel is the average or not, but then you see this very slowly moving yellowish line at the bottom, and that's the rate which the ECB charges to banks for its lending to banks. And everybody talks about central banks tightening policy. Right? You have to take a magnifying glass to see the tightening compared to the explosion in nominal GDP growth. That's why I'm saying we shouldn't complain too much about tightening, especially not in the euro area. I don't think that has a major limiting influence on growth, at least in the euro area at present. So let me just come to the end. So on the war, I'm on the pessimistic side. It will get worse before it gets better, and there's a grave danger lurking there, somewhat on the horizon. Very little we can do about it. The rebound of the European economy and also the world economy has been stopped, but I think this will be temporary. In the US, it was fiscal policy, which was less generous than before. In Europe, it was energy prices, but this should be manageable. Monetary policy, I don't think, is really a very important, has so far had a very important tightening impact. And the recession should be confined mainly to industry. So Europe, I'm not predicting a great future for Europe, but basically it should soon return to its sluggish pre-COVID performance of 1.5 to 2% per year. And the slowdown in China is likely to continue. Let me stop on this upbeat note. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Any questions from the floor for Daniel? Can we have the microphone for Phil? Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to hog the microphone, but if nobody else is asking one. So my takeaway from your excellent presentation, thank you very much, was that you are slightly more bullish about the Eurozone than I would say consensus from everything that I read, and you're slightly more bearish about the US than everything I read in the reduction in funds that are coming out of the US. So my question is, what do you think that's going to do to currency? Is the euro close to the end of its rapid fall against the dollar?
The cardinal rule among economists is never predict currencies. I learned that in my first year of graduate studies. Now, I would say this, at the present exchange rates, the euro area will experience an export boom, which, as I said earlier, which will then re-establish equilibrium. And the US is likely to see an even weaker economy. The US is less open, but still exports and imports matter to some extent. And also the US has a much more hawkish monetary policy. And we know that as a rule, in the short term, monetary policy can drive exchange rates. Now, the real question is whether it will go overboard like the 1960s and 1986, when we had the 85, when we had the Reagan policies, which are very similar to right now. And then I think central banks will intervene. But around the present level, I think the ECB is quite happy. It could be, it's happy enough to say, we don't do anything, let's work it through the system. And the weak exchange rate is very important also for the Southern European members, like Italy and Spain, because the Germans can live with almost any exchange rate, but not the Italians. So this weak exchange rate helps to stabilize the euro area.
Thank you. Any other questions? May I have one? That would be about the steel industry, though. We know that some major governments in Europe, like Spain, Italy, Germany, have already provided certain support for their steel industries, respective steel industries, taking into consideration the current situation with the increasing energy prices and so on. Would you expect further support within the EU to the steel industry, or would that be it?
I don't think there will be support at the EU level, specific for the steel industry. I think there will be continuing support, and you have seen the German Commission, perhaps, of experts, which has this. I don't know whether specifically for the steel industry. We also know that actually gas consumption by industry in Germany has fallen by 20%. It has not really fallen in other countries. And therefore, the concern now in Germany is that there's somewhat an imbalance. The recommendations today are that German companies can ask for the government to have a subsidy for a lower price, equivalent to, if I remember correctly, 7 cents per kilowatt hour of gas, for 70% of last year's consumption. Right? And then whatever else they need, they have to buy on the open market. If they actually save more than 30%, so they don't need their 70%, they can actually sell, I have surplus gas here, which I sell to somebody else. So German steel producers might have an incentive, depending on where the prices are, right? To say, we reduce consumption a lot, and the surplus gas we can sell for a high price. Right? That is also help to the steel industry, maybe not the help you want, but from an economic point of view, it makes sense.
Some additional motivation.
But of course, it all depends on where the wholesale price then go. Right? If 7 cents is like 70 euros per megawatt hour, 150 on the TTF, 80 average import price. So not quite clear what they're going to do when this thing comes about. So I would say no special additional help for the steel industry, but they're part of the overall scheme.
Thank you. Complicated times. Any other questions? So thank you very much, Daniel.